Jung and Mythology, the introduction, Jung's Copernican revolution. So welcome, as I've already said. Very, very glad to have so many people show up and show interest in this. I think it's really a vital topic these days because we're seeing mythic things happen every day. Today, we're going to talk about how Carl Jung's psychological theory has completely changed our understanding of myth and its role in human culture. We'll also say a little about how he has brought the change about by briefly surveying his theory in a mythological frame. Finally, we'll go over an outline of the upcoming 8-week course. It will start next Saturday at this time, Jung and Mythology. And then we'll open the floor for questions and discussion. And I hope, it's always difficult to know, there's so much material, you have to be very selective what we're going to talk about. And I don't want to have too little and then have just dead air, and I also don't want to have too much and overwhelm people. So I'll do my best. I will say this about my philosophy about teaching. In the old days, teaching was about a mind dump where you just drop everything in the student's lap, and the great wise one dispenses all this knowledge. You regurgitate it back, and once you prove that you've memorized everything, then you get an A. That's not the approach of this class or this course. The approach is more like graduate school, where you survey a broad area, you show all the different resources available, and that way you can make a choice as to go in. It's more proactive, it's more, the student is required to do things. And also, this isn't, this class today and the subsequent classes aren't really a webinar. What I do is, I teach in colleges, and I like that approach. I like this approach of showing a broad spectrum of ideas and letting people dig in where they want to. So you'll find that I do provide more information than you can probably digest all in one sitting, but this is going to be recorded if technology cooperates, and you'll be able to follow up, and if you miss something or if I go too fast, you can catch up on that. And the same thing with all the subsequent classes. The course comes with an online platform. There'll be extra readings if you enjoy that. All of the recorded classes will be available on that, and like that. So that's just a little heads up about the way I do this. If you're looking for just a webinar with just a light overview, then this might not be for you. But if you want to really dig in, then I hope we can have some fun with it. So I'll start by saying a little bit about myself. My name is Dr. James Newell. I've been a professional musician all my life. I dropped out of high school when I was 15 years old and traveled with bands. And then when I was 40 years old, I was offered a minority scholarship at a black college. And eventually I went there and graduated with honors and got my master's degree in pastoral counseling from Vanderbilt University, and then my doctorate in history of religions from Vanderbilt Graduate School of Religion. I currently teach world religions online for Central Michigan University. And since this past January, I've taken on the role of director of the Depth Psychology Alliance. And that's a long story, and I'd like to talk about that sometime, but I want to move right on. But we're very grateful to our founder, Bonnie Bright, who's doing other exciting things at the moment and has asked me to take over. So the course we're going to begin today is the 4th of a planned 8-course certification program in depth psychology. In spring of 2016, the board of the Depth Psychology Alliance asked me to go ahead and experiment with some ideas I had for the Depth Psychology Alliance and to produce a certification program in depth psychology. So I began experimenting first with a 4-module introduction to Jungian psychology, and the participants enjoyed that, but most of them felt that there was so much to learn that we really should expand the course. So in the fall of 2016, that same year, we tried again, and this time with an 8-module course. That course was so well received that we went ahead with an 8-module course on applied Jungian psychology in the spring of 2017. And then this past fall, we did Jung and alchemy. So now with the completion of this course on Jung and mythology, we will have developed 1/2 of the content of a proposed 8-week certification program. And if you do take this course and complete it with the online requirements, there's some discussions and some quizzes, some readings, and a paper at the end. And if you do all that, you will get a certificate, which can be later, if you choose, can be used for credit towards the certification program. The remaining courses will be an introduction to depth psychology, Jung and fairy tales, Jung and dreams, and Jung and active imagination. So there's quite a curriculum, and I think it's dense, and it's really there's a lot to be learned in this field. It's not hard to learn, but there's just a lot, and a lot of people don't have that kind of background. If you want that, I think this is we're trying to provide a resource that isn't already out there unless you pay lots and lots of money in a major institution. So instinct to reason, reason to intuition. So I want to move now to what I'm calling Jung's Copernican revolution. It's been said that human beings have progressed from instinct to reason, and now the evolution, the transition to come, is to move from reason to intuition. This is not saying moving to intuition. That doesn't mean leaving rational thought behind. The idea is a higher order of reason. It's not reasonable, it's not rational to leave out the intrusions of the unconscious, particularly the intrusions of the collective unconscious, when making our decisions. Jung referred to this original cultural shift or transition in various ways. I'm calling it moving from instinct to reason. Jung might have said from eros to logos, or from feminine to masculine, from the mythic to rationality, etc. And also, when I say instinct, I'm thinking of sensation and feeling. I think that's how Jung would have seen it. And of course, moving into reason is an important phase, but sometimes when people move to reason, they leave out sensation and feeling. And intuition, of course, those four are the four functions that Jung talks about. The idea is having them all on board as a part of a whole person with a whole thinking process that includes what might otherwise unconsciously intrude from the unconscious. So the project of modern science has been to perfect reason. The highest goals of science have been to perfect human reason for the service of human life, and that's a worthy goal. That's one I think we should all strive to. But what this argument says is that so-called pure reason emanates from the conscious ego and does not take into account intrusions from the unconscious. In order to actually perfect reason, we must include the unconscious and its imperatives in our deliberations. And by imperatives, I mean the complexes and things that intrude unbidden. If we engage them consciously, they do not trip us up. So for Jung, this movement from reason to intuition, that I'm calling it, it means thinking, sensation, feeling, and intuition must all be available levels of perception. For this to be possible, we must be in dialogue with, listen to, and take seriously not only the personal unconscious, the unconscious memories of our past deeds and misdeeds, but we also must listen to and take seriously the structured energy forms of the structured deep unconscious. Jung called these structured energy patterns archetypes of the collective unconscious. And his idea of mythology relates directly to the archetypes, and his interpretations of mythology relate right to this. So by mentioning archetypes of the collective unconscious, we now are entering into deep waters. While some of you may be quite familiar with Jungian terms and jargon, others may not. In order to understand Jung's theory of myth and how he used myth in his psychotherapeutic work, we must understand at least something of his theory. His theory in Cliff Notes form is simply that the entire body of world mythology is a mirror or reflection of the structures of the collective unconscious. Now that's a big statement, and I'll try to tease it out more and more as we go along. So what I want to do now is to go through a brief outline of Jung's theory, but I'd like to do so while at the same time demonstrating some parallel myths that illustrate each phase of each of the phases of the theory. And this is something that Jung did in Symbols of Transformation, his sort of groundbreaking book that was really the break between him and Sigmund Freud. But when he did Symbols of Transformation originally, he did not really have an entire theory worked out. He was just realizing all these things that he didn't have a systematic way of presenting. Later in the 40s, Joseph Campbell did some of that, as did some of that same work with a little more structure. Erich Neumann did his book Origins and History of Consciousness, which really very closely parallels ancient mythology with the developmental phases of the psyche that we're going to go into. I really would have liked, for those of you doing the certification through this course, I would have liked to use Erich Neumann's book, Origins and History of Consciousness, but it's so big and so dense and there's so much there, we really would need a whole separate course just for that book. So I'll reference him from time to time, but we're not going to use that. So what I do want to do is use I'm mentioning these three because they all kind of use these techniques, especially Neumann, to show how the myths are, as I say, mirrors of these structures that come into play at various phases of development. When we get a clear picture of that, then we're not just, it's a great thing to have a big catalog of myths in your memory and stories that you can call up, but knowing why and how a Jungian is interested in these myths, and why a Jungian is interested in them, and how we would use them, whether working with people or studying culture or just doing our own personal work, when we know what the temenos is, what the end goal is, then we have a chance of using these things to their best effect. So the image to the right describes and I hope you can see that on your screen, that describes the mature Jungian psyche. You have the ego and the self. They're separated by the unconscious and the consciousness, but they're connected. You see these like energy patterns. They don't have arrows, but one you could say is going from messages from the deep unconscious to the ego, and the ego listening and responding back. And this is what Neumann called an ego self axis. We have the collective unconscious, which is below the personal unconscious. And this is kind of as I say, a metaphoric idea of how the psyche is structured. This persona is how the ego deals with the outer world. It's the sense of identity and the role that one plays in the outer world. It's just a brief, and even this picture is incomplete, but it's kind of a brief summary of the structure of the Jungian psyche, and these will come into play when we look at the myths. So mythologically speaking, this mature psyche is preceded by the ideas found in creation myths, when consciousness is still unmanifest and fused with the Great Mother in unconsciousness. So creation myths then would represent this time before the ego has emerged and separated a little bit from the deep unconscious. And I'll show you a diagram of that in a minute. So this is the time without beginning, the Ouroboros, which is the snake which bites its own tail, just an eternal round that never really takes in any information from outside, nor really does anything with the information inside, just stays sort of complete in that unconscious state. It's the Great Mother. Mythologically, Erich Neumann, when talking about this phase, quotes this passage in the Tao Te Ching in relation to this phase. And Lao Tzu in the Tao Te Ching says, "There was something formless yet complete that existed before heaven and earth, without sound, without substance, dependent on nothing, unchanging, all-pervading, unfailing. One may think of it as the mother of all things under heaven." So this is the Euroboric beginning, the fusion with the Great Mother. Now this is a diagram, again, metaphorically shows this figure one would be this phase that we just described. This is the ego still encased in the self. And we'll see this again, and we'll see myths that parallel these different developmental phases, figure 2, figure 3, figure 4. So individuation is the word that Jung used to describe the differentiation of the conscious ego from the unconscious self. From the completely enclosed Euroboric unconscious that we just described, the ego begins to emerge, as in this picture here. As Jung says in regard to individuation, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand. Remember, we just described that. That's the role that one plays in social life, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. And that's the archetypes of the collective unconscious he's talking about. So the aim is to be, the aim, in other words, is to get to this place where you're not unconscious, and yet you have this ego self axis, which connects the ego from the self. And as I said before, there's a communication between the two that keeps the energies flowing, contained, and available for the creative work that the individual might engage in. So this diagram is one way to illustrate this slow process of differentiation of the ego from the self. Originally for the child, the self is experienced as and through the mother, through a complete identification. Gradually, as one matures, a greater sense of personal identity develops, as we separate here, and one experiences itself as an individual distinct from the mother and father. The process is accompanied by social adaptation and the development of a persona. And that's, again, this is the persona here in this little picture on the side. You got the ego connected to the unconscious. Now that's, again, a fully mature ego, but to one degree or another, wherever we are on this continuum of separation, differentiation between the ego and the deep unconscious, the goal is to get to this sort of mandalic spot. So in mythological terms, this separation of the ego from the self is very often depicted. There's many Polynesian, Pacific Islands myths about the separation of the world parents. This is an Egyptian myth, a little unusual because usually in the West, certainly, we're used to the earth. See, this is Geb down here, is the earth father, and Nut is the sky mother. Usually it's the sky god is a father god and the earth is the earth mother, but in Egyptian mythology it's turned around. So eventually, at some point, the ego begins to break through to separate from its passive unconsciousness, and it begins to break into the light of consciousness. This is when the snake tempts Eve in the garden, or when the yellow ball rolls into Iron John's cage in the Grimm's tale, or when we have a car accident and they're late for work and lose a big contract, and suddenly our world is upside down. Something has intruded, some unconscious element has intruded. In this case, we're representing this kind of break, this kind of beginning of light of consciousness starting to come in through this Egyptian myth. So this separation of the world parents, in a simplification of the Egyptian myth, Geb, the earth father, and Nut, the earth mother, are too close together, and their father, Shu, and his name means the one who rises. You can see consciousness rising. It's almost like blowing up a balloon. As consciousness begins to assert itself, it necessarily separates these two things. And it separates Nut and Geb, and thus creates the world, i.e. creates consciousness or creates being. Geb and Nut, as a result of this, then give birth to Isis and Osiris, and there's a whole another really basis of all Egyptian mythology through them. And Neumann does some brilliant work with Isis and Osiris in his book. So again, this is a way of depicting the beginnings, this figure two. This is a mythological way of understanding those things, that beginning of the ego to separate from the self. Now, there are two types of individuation, or it's at least possible to understand in order to sort of get our arms around all the processes that go on. We can understand two types of individuation. And we can begin to see now that the Jungian unconsciousness is not just personal memories of past events, as Freud believed. For Jung, the deep unconscious is structured. Myth is important for Jung because myth is essentially a mirror image of the psyche, a reflection projected outwards of the inner structures of the unconscious. And that's why these myths are formed in the way they are, because it's just as things are dawning in the consciousness of people, they started to, Jung always said that we, and Neumann, the way we most often become conscious of archetypes and of our own complexes is that we project them outward, we see them in others, and in this case, we sometimes create narratives, we create art, we create things that are very resonant and powerful and numinous for us. They're glowing with archetypal energies because they are beginning to connect us with this deep unconscious, and that's part of this ego self-axis thing. And when we do it in the natural way, of things, we, as I say, two phases of individuation. One is a natural process, the other artificial. We're calling it artificial. And this is, I'm drawing a lot from Yolanda Jacobi here, who is a disciple of Jung. But the natural process is just being religious or being respectful, having something, as I say in the 12 steps, a power greater than myself. And it creates humility, and there's sort of a numinous connection with that. We go to church, if we become a Buddhist, or if we enter into a mythological worldview, and we say, yes, this is the truth, this contains me, we can then have a connection to this deep unconscious through the mythology, and we're contained within it. And for Jung, this is what people have done for millennia. They've been religious, and by doing that, by entering into spiritual practices, religious practices, ritual practices, they maintain this connection unconsciously with the deep archetypal structures. And this regulates the grandiose archetypal energies so that one is not overwhelmed by them. And it allows people to be very creative, and people create the wheel, and they created fire, and or learned how to work with fire. They learned how to build things, and eventually they learned how to create agriculture and all that, because through religious process, they were able to contain those energies, and those energies were then released in creative ways. So individuation is essentially a natural developmental process that all living beings go through. Even, you could say, an acorn individuates into an oak tree. If all the environmental factors are there, then the sort of archetypal intent of the acorn is to become an oak tree, and it's able to actually do that. It individuates into oak trees. Some organisms have adaptive processes, and some simply develop along organic lines. However, human beings, as I've said, human beings have developed the adaptive processes of religious practices, ritual, and myth that have historically helped the natural individuation process along. Now, what I'm calling the artificial process is the process that we actively, consciously, proactively engage in through doing individual inner work, working with a therapist in individual or group settings, or just doing dream work. We're consciously aware and consciously engaging in this individuation process, sometimes because it's been thrown off the rails by some sort of traumatic experience, sometimes simply because we're feeling restless and we need to process those energies. And as I think it was Edinger put it, we then turn to depth psychology because we need it. We need it in order to contain these grandiose energies. And if we don't have it, then we simply put them someplace else, either in an ideology or onto money or onto celebrity or somewhere else. It goes somewhere. But if we can do our inner work and connect to those grandiose energies and contain them in some way, we have a chance to free up those energies so that we can use them for whatever work we're engaged in. So we call this process artificial because of the proactive involvement of consciousness with the natural unconscious developmental processes through dream work and active imagination and whatever work we may want to do. So this process, i.e. the artificial approach to individuation, is a parallel to the hero myth and also to the development of a persona and the ongoing process of developing an identity and a unique personality. So it's easy to try to rush this artificial process along, but actually much patience is required, because the art of individuation requires waiting for the unconscious to act. We sometimes just sitting quietly and waiting for something to happen. If we don't sit quietly, we simply impose this constantly working mind, the ego mind, which is already dissociated from the deep unconscious, and we're just kind of spinning our wheels. So quieting the mind and allowing dreams, visions, active imagination contents to come up. This is how the artificial process has to work. Now, so likewise, in addition to two different types of individuation, there are also two essential stages in the process of individuation. The first stage is the task of the first half of life and involves the natural development of personality, social adaptation or persona, and finding a mate, developing a work path, and finding one's place in society. The second stage involves integrating the shadow and learning to regulate the energies of the collective unconscious, and especially the archetype of the self. Jung focuses a great deal of his energy on studying this second stage of life, but both of them have correlates in mythology, which is, we're going to talk specifically about the hero myth in mythology, and different aspects of it relating to different stages. So this is important to know which stage of the individuation process one is working on. The task of the first stage requires building a strong ego and adapting to the collective by constructing an effective social identity, what Jung called a persona. These tasks require a different type of focus from the tasks of the second stage. The second stage has more to do with throwing off the social role and developing a relationship with the objects of the inner world. And it's possible, and many times necessary, especially trauma survivors, it's possible for someone to have work to do on both stages at the same time. There's, in some ways, some areas we're highly developed and can function highly, but we can go thus far and no further until we do the work on that, the unfinished work on that earlier stage. So how does this relate to mythology and the hero myth? Both of the stages of the individuation process involve a confrontation with the unconscious of some kind or other. Typically, it's represented mythologically by the hero myth. And I'm saying represented, these things aren't signs, they're symbols. All of the myths Jung understood as symbols, and symbols have multiple meanings and can mean different things to different people at different phases, and different cultures are going to see them differently. For some cultures, a myth is not going to have any meaning. For others, or for other individuals, it's going to radiate with numinous energy, and that's going to be an area that's going to be very fruitful for that person. So the first stage involves heroically becoming aware of and withdrawing consciousness from projections and identifications. This is psychologically equivalent to the phase of slaying the mother. There's when the child is encased, or even an adult psychologically encased, still in the mother phase back here. It's part of the hero work to just break out of that embrace of the mother and go out a little bit on one's own. And the way someone usually would do that is to identify, say with the male, will be to identify with the father and develop a persona that's identical to the father. So then he has to slay the father in order to develop his own unique individuality instead of just being a mirror clone of his father. And for a woman, the identification with the mother is important, and she has to slay the father, who's very attractive and very seductive. That the relationship is seductive, but she needs to, rather than just be daddy's little girl, she needs to be able to identify with the mother and with the roles of the mother, and with her, be able to understand her competition with the mother for her father's affection. And through that, that's she's going to start with the slaying of the father, whereas the man, and typically these myths that we're going, at least Western myths, we're going to find the male being the dominant figure and the female being secondary. But the way the process would work for women is that she eventually, the second step, the persona identification step, is going to be a slaying of the mother. But most of the literature starts first with the male, and we'll have to have women. Yeah, well, I know in many ways one of the best female Jungians to write on these things specifically is Esther Harding. Her book Women's Mysteries is a great one for getting more of the female side. So the second stage, and again I'm talking mainly in the traditional patriarchal levels, and these are the ones that that Neumann talks about. We get complicated when we switch them around, but it's important to know that it's definitely not exclusive, but it's important to know, even a woman, it's important to know the patriarchal male myths, because we are still, although much work is being done, we're still living under a sort of patriarchal cultural umbrella. So the second stage involves heroically throwing off the social role, again, for the man identifying with the father, and reestablishing communications between consciousness and the unconscious so that one can become who one authentically is. And this, as I say, traditionally is the psychological equivalent of slaying the father. And this is paralleling, as I said, the Erich Neumann's way of looking at it, and there are others, but many of them are not developed as well as they need to be. So this is a basic outline of that breaking out of the being enclosed in the unconscious. And of course, Joseph Campbell is very famous for articulating the hero's journey. Jung, again, Jung, most of Symbols of Transformation is about, or much of it is about, the hero's journey, and this is where Campbell picked it up, and this is also where Neumann picked it up. And this model that I want to talk about here, and those of you, I know there are several with us who've done the other courses or some of the other courses, and you're familiar with this, but the idea of the call of the adventure is like the birth of the hero. He can go into it consciously, or he can refuse the call and go into it unconsciously, but one way or another he's going to depart from his ordinary experience. And as I say, this could be from an automobile accident, from getting fired from a job. It can be any of the traditional hero stories that we're familiar with. But whatever it is, it causes one to have to go down into the unconscious, be initiated, cross the threshold, encounter tests, allies and enemies, finally hit rock bottom, go through some sort of ordeal in order to basically go back through this same cycle over and over again. Bring back some light of consciousness into the world, some treasure, be resurrected, and then return to the ordinary world. Now, if that was all it was, just one big thing, that would be bad enough. But the process involves doing this same process over and over and over again. And I'm going to show, now this is sort of an archetypal, mythological way of looking at a process that Jung and others, this is an articulation of it by Edward Edinger, but it's found in Ego and Archetype. So if we look at this same round that we just talked about, the heroic hero's journey, and as I said, the breaking out of the mother womb, and then breaking out of the identification with the persona, and all that is a process of doing this over and over again. And the Jungian articulation of this mythological theme is you start out with original wholeness, which is a sort of inflation of being full of one's own individual power. But when one gets into too much of an active inflation, see right here, we're just about, you could say at the original wholeness place, we're just about aware and conscious of our real, authentic value. But we're so kind of thrilled by that, and that so connects us to the archetype of that idea of the heroic archetype, for example, of that power, that at some point we tend to take on a little bit too much of that power, particularly in social groups. If we have any social power, people begin to project on us, and this adds to an exaggerated sense of self-importance, and it leads to what Jung would call active inflation. And then in that state of active inflation, we do some inflated or heroic act which backfires, And again, we fall below. We're rejected by the people who would project it onto us. They thought we were great. It turns out we've got feet of clay. We feel an alienation from these archetypal energies, whereas before we were just vibrant with archetypal numinosity. Now we're alienated. We're wounded. We're dismembered. We're repenting. We feel real humility in the face of our real failures. We accept who we really are. We begin to bring back some of the wisdom from that fall from grace, and we have the sort of passive inflation of saying, yeah, wow, I'm back in touch with reality, and we get back to this place of original wholeness where, again, yes, I have genuine power, I have genuine worth, but if I don't keep that ego self-access stuff, if I don't maintain that connection with the real archetypal energies and recognize that they are not me, they are not my ego, and I'm not, if I can avoid being identified with them, I can stay in this place of ego self-access, energy flowing back and forth. But if at any time I get so inflated that I forget that it's not me, that it's these archetypal energies, then I get into active inflation, and we go through the whole thing over and over again. And the purpose of this round of the hero's journey of inflation and alienation, inflation and alienation, the purpose is to come to a place where we maintain that connection with the deep unconscious on a regular, you could say, on the basis of like a practice. That's why people in spiritual life talk about having a practice, because that practice keeps you related to the archetypal energies.
Is there any way to kind of break that cycle at all, James? Or we kind of...
Yeah, no, the way you break the cycle is to develop a conscious connection with the unconscious.
Gotcha.
To working, ongoing, developing that. All of this cycle is in order to develop an ego self-access, where you are constantly, not only occasionally, but you are constantly aware of where the energy comes from. It comes from the deep unconscious. It does not come from, in other words, I can't, maybe some yogis can, but I cannot control my heartbeat. I can only control my breath to a certain period of time. I can't necessarily say that when I wake up tomorrow, I'm going to have all that vibrant energy. I'm at the mercy of my physical body. I'm at the mercy of forces in the world. And I get by the grace of what? I don't know. However we figure that, we have to maintain that sense of humility that we do not fall prey to inflation. And this is what I'm about to describe more. Does that answer briefly? Anyway, I'm going to say more about this right now.
We had another question. Isn't that exhausting to keep it in balance all the time?
You bet. Yeah. I'm tired. I'm tired thinking about it.
That's right.
Yeah, but that's why we develop. We try to eat well. We try to get exercise. We try to it's in Hinduism, the myth is creator, preserver, and destroyer, and there's something always working to destroy things. We have to be working all the time to be in touch with the creator, and to be constantly doing things to preserve that energy, because if we let down our guard for a minute, the destroyer is always operating.
Right. Sounds very Paul is it Tillich?
Well, that one is Hindu, so I'm not sure. I mean, Tillich certainly was in touch with that, but it's it's Jungian. I mean, that's Jung always said. For example, they say, "What's the cure of puer aeternus?" And he'd say, "Well, work." I had one client one time who was a young guy, and he wanted me to tell him the secret of how to get out of this malaise he was in. I said, "Well, take a job." He said, "Well, there are no jobs." I said, "Well, there's jobs at McDonald's." And this guy was a very highly trained classical kind of guy, and the idea of working at McDonald's just so horrified him that he couldn't stand it. But that's exactly what this particular guy needed. I mean, not to work at McDonald's, but to know that he's not better than the guys that work at McDonald's just because he's got some education or whatever. Right. It's like in the Iron John story, you have to get down into the ashes,
Yes.
And it's that kind of thing. You have to learn that even there's no place in the continuum of life where you get to not be humble,
Right.
And no matter how many skills you develop or whatever, you're always at the mercy of having a heart attack or the hand of God coming down just for the hell of it and striking you,
Right.
you know.
And
So,
it gets tiring being humbled all the
yeah,
time. So you might as well
I
do it
know.
yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm really good at it, so I don't have to worry about it. I'm great at
That's
being
right.
humble. Yeah, been working
Excellent.
at it so long. Yeah. So yeah, no, it's very difficult. It's very tricky. You know,
Yeah.
it's the ego is hydra-headed, as they say.
Yes,
So,
sir.
anyways, the dangers that we face on the hero's journey are just those we're talking about. They emerge when we fail to face and deal with the challenges arising from the unconscious. And that's the thing about humility, is that if we not if we don't maintain our humility, that complex is going to come up every time and kick us in the butt. So when we fail to develop the skills involved in managing our complexes through establishing a dialogue with the unconscious, we risk falling prey to either identification with archetypal energies, which results in anxiety. If we're anxiety to the point that we eventually will do something that hurts ourselves or someone else, and or if we go the other way and we're completely alienated from the archetypal energies, then we experience depression. So all the depressive and anxiety, what do you call them, ailments or whatever in the DSM-4, you can be, or was it 5 or 6 now? I'm not sure. They can be traced to this identification and alienation of archetypal energies. Either of these states, identification or alienation, can lead to a host of diagnosable neuroses. So dialoguing with and remaining in communication with the unconscious through dream work, active imagination, and other techniques can help us to learn how to regulate and steward powerful archetypal energies. If we do not learn how to do so, we may either become identified with the energies and think we are in control of them, or we become alienated from our own life energies and fall into a depression. And in terms of the it being exhausting, it is exhausting, and yet it's way more exhausting to not be in touch with it, to not enter into that process, because the same process goes on whether we're conscious of it or not. And when you get into, I mean, if you've ever gotten into a practice of, if what's lacking in your psyche is the sensate, and then you start getting into exercise and stuff like that, you find whole new sort of numinous realms that you weren't even aware of. If you've never really been able to think clearly, and you start to work on developing your thinking skills, it suddenly becomes very numinous, this whole world of thinking. And although it sounds exhausting, the more we enter into it, the more these archetypal energies then become available to us instead of constantly kicking us from behind. So what starts out being tiring actually gets energized by opening up our access to these archetypal life energies that they're our birthright. We're born with a human body and a human central nervous system, which provides us with energies if we will only connect with them in a way that allows us access to the energies that they can give us. So again, I've been talking throughout this about this business of the step as we learn with these skills of kind of pulling ourselves out of the unconscious and not succumbing to the social roles that can be exhausting because they split us off again from our real selves in the deep unconscious. That's the development of this ego self axis. So when we are in regular healthy attunement with the deep unconscious, when we humbly listen to and attempt to respond effectively to intrusions or communications from the unconscious, we could be said to be developing what Neumann has called the ego self axis. And just archetypally and mythologically, this is a picture of from the biblical story of Jacob, the Jacob's ladder. And Edinger suggests this as a symbol of the ego self axis. And this is another one. This is Michelangelo's picture from the Sistine Chapel. And notice it's Adam is the ego, God is the archetypal self, and God is sending up the energy, and Adam is not only receiving it, but he's also looking thankfully and humbly at God, who's just a little bit higher than him, and the energy is going back and forth. So there's a very positive connection. It's kind of like you could say the first covenant here is when God gives Adam life, and that's also a kind of image for the ego self axis. So this axis between the conscious ego and again, all of these different things, the idea of the self, I mean, I haven't gone into detail about this, but God would be a representation of the it doesn't mean that there's no metaphysical God, but as far as the physical world and the central nervous system is, God is imago Dei. The Judeo-Christian God is an image of the imago Dei. It carries the energy and the imagery of the archetypal self. And in this case, certainly Edinger and others would say that Adam represents the ego. That's not, again, it's not a sign. It doesn't mean that that's what they are, but they're symbols. They have multiple meanings. They're multivalent, but we can certainly read them in that way I just described. I just don't want people to get the idea that that's, I'm saying that that's what they are, period. This is, they act symbolically on multiple levels. So this axis, this ego-self axis between the conscious ego and the deep unconscious allows the strong ego personality to regulate archetypal energies and makes those creative energies available to consciousness. Now, finally, when we're so incredibly perfect at regulating these energies and everything, the final step in the symbolic realm, in the mythological realm, is the mandala, or the conjunctio in alchemy. So as we continue to work on this ego-self axis, and as the deep unconscious becomes more and more connected to the ego, and the ego becomes more and more energized by well-regulated archetypal energies, we experience ideally what the alchemists called the conjunctio oppositorium, or the conjunction of opposites, the coming together of opposites. That is to say, the coming together of consciousness and the unconscious in a more or less permanent conjunction. So that's not what we've just gone through. What I've tried to show is how this myth interprets various mythological symbols and various mythological symbols, how they represent different phases. Now, the idea of a Jungian reading of myth generally, and in a broad sense, is that the myths are mirrors to the collective unconscious, and we can see in the different trajectory of human culture and human development. In the earlier creation myths, we see very, very basic reflections of maybe an infantile psyche. Move on a little bit more, we see reflections of sort of an adolescent psyche more and more. And they say, the phrase is, I think, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, which is, I usually get it wrong, but it's a very fancy way to say that each organism, when a new person or dog or cat or whatever is born, or a new seed is planted and grows for a plant, that seed has to go through all the evolutionary developmental processes that the organism has gone through in the last million years. Each person has to go through that whole thing. And so with this archetypal heritage in mythology, Jung reads these as developmental phases in people that are still in us, that have evolutionarily evolved through us, and each one of us needs to go through these phases. So I've gone through a whole big raft of phases. We're not all going to get these at once, but the point is, this is how Jung reads and understands mythology. And he uses it, well, how he uses it, well, we can, if you have questions, we can, I can address them. We're going to have a whole module on that, a whole class on that later in the course. So what I want to do now is go ahead and, I want to go through the course. What did I just do? Hold on a second. Okay, there it is. I want to go through the course and just let you know what each of the modules are going to do. Just fairly quickly, I'll do that just so you can see what is upcoming if you decide that you want to go ahead and sign up. So before I do that, Jeremy, is there any questions that I haven't addressed?
Nope, we're good to go.
Okay, so I'm going to try and, I may rush through it a little bit. I just want to give you a general idea. And then I hope, please, think about some questions, maybe write some questions down if you haven't already. And I hope we can have a discussion for however long you guys can stand it or want to do it. And I'm going to jump right in now with Module 1. What we're going to talk about are mainstream theories of myth. What happens is Jung, as I've said, and I've got a blog which I published last week, I think, on Jung and myth and this Copernican revolution of how he sees things in a way that includes things that everybody else just doesn't even really pay adequately. Beginning slowly, mainly through feminist studies, some of Jung's ideas are sneaking into academic thought, but no one really embraces him in the mainstream academy. There are a couple of places where they allow him to be somewhat acceptable, but his whole theory, rarely does anyone really embrace his whole theory. If they did, it would change the whole landscape of the academic world. In any case, so what we're going to do in this module is look at how mainstream academics who have not embraced Jung, how they understand myth, what the dominant theories have been in the past, how myth is understood today, and how it develops. Now, this is not only important as a help in understanding the revolutionary nature of Jung's approach to myth, although it is that, because we can see in contradistinction how very, very different that is, and we'll talk about that at length. But what it also does is see the main reason that Jung is interested in myth is because of this. It's sort of a huge encyclopedia, you could say, of parallels to what appear in dreams and fantasies and where people are. You find what he called amplifications. You find parallel ideas, and then that can give you some insight into why a particular symbol or a particular idea either occurred in the person's vision or their imagination or in their dream or in their active imagination work. So that's really the main reason he's interested in myth. However, there's a huge body of myth. So when we understand mainstream theories, it will help us to navigate the massive amounts of mainstream work on myth that can aid us in building up our own repertoires of myth and understandings of myth and what myths are out there cross-culturally, what the different patterns are. When we can use mainstream mythologists, their theories and their writings, if we can use them as resources, then we really can kind of quickly, or certainly more quickly than if we tried to read every single myth that's out there, we can more quickly learn how to amplify dreams and other products of the unconscious. So we're going to start with that as a beginning of our resources and then move to what I think is a very big developmental leap with Jung in Module 2 to how Jung understands myth. So having looked at some of those, we'll look at the radical difference between Jung and these early theorists. We'll expand on and review some of the bits of Jung's theory we've discussed today, and we'll see how Jung links this theory to the world of mythology and why he sees myth as a mirror or a template for the deep structures of the collective unconscious, which he called the archetypes. And there's a whole theoretical basis. I've tried to, as a really Reader's Digest condensed quick run through not only of his theory, but also of how myths connect to it. But as I say, it's required to have some idea of the theory in order to understand his understanding of myth and to apply it in the way he did in whether we're doing work with ourselves, if we're professionals, work with other people. There's a lot of rich resources in the world of myth if we know what the Jungian purpose is of using them. So that purpose is what we'll explore in Module 3, how he used myth. It's basically applied myth. We'll look at how he made use of myth when he worked with patients, how he saw myth operating culturally in both the ancient worlds and the modern world. And we'll focus on Jung's technique of amplification, which I just mentioned, whereby, for example, looking for mythic patterns that parallel dream images can help to understand the meaning of symbols that arise at a particular time in an individual's life or in the life of a group. Why did this dream appear today? Why did this image appear now? These kind of things will help us, will help Jung, and through amplification, again, the more myths we know, the more we can kind of dive into myths, the more they can be useful when we apply them to his theory. Yes.
Is
No?
there a textbook that we're going to be following, or is this kind of?
Yeah, for anybody who everybody who signs up for the course will have access to the online platform, which will have different resources, videos, and some articles, and it'll have a curriculum to follow. And we also recommend if you're going to go for this certificate, you'll need to read the textbook, and the textbook is going to be I've got it right here somewhere. It's Jung and the Jungians on Myth by Stephen Walker. I'm pretty sure that's who it is. Jung and the Jungians on Myth. And again, the hard thing about getting a good book on Jung and myth, or any book on any of these topics that we've been covering in the other courses and will be covering, is that on the one hand, you want people to just be able to come in and take a particular course. If it's in a linear way and you start at the beginning and go to the end as in a certification program, you know what people know and what they don't know because they learned it in the previous module. For these, the way we're doing it now, and with virtually every book on Jung, at least a popular book on Jung, there has to be a huge exposition on Jung's theory. Jung's theory is not difficult, but it's complex enough that if you don't know it, then you're just going to be lost when you try to follow it. So this book, Jung and the Jungians on Myth, has a lot of exposition of Jung's theory, which for those of you who are pretty well steeped in Jung, you're not going to be so thrilled with it. But it's a rich book. It's got a lot of value in it, and it gives us a good spectrum. So it's both a little introductory, and it's also got things for people who know more about Jung. A good book, which I thought about using, is this book, Jung on Mythology, in the Encountering Jung series. Some of those just they're definitely not for beginners. I think everybody should read Jung, and they're a great way to get into reading Jung if you haven't read Jung. But for this course, it just seemed like that would be asking. If it really was a graduate course, I would definitely assign it, because along with some of Jung's own books. But anyway, so that's the book, Jung and the Jungians on Myth. And I also recommend this book with a selection of Jung's own writings on mythology, called Jung on Mythology, with Robert Siegel. And we'll have some excerpts from that in the class available to people on the online platform. So sorry, I didn't mean to go on so much about that, but it's kind of I've went through a lot trying to figure out which one I was going to choose. So anything else?
Nope, we're good.
Okay, so in the fourth module, we're going to explore a number of myths that have particular psychological or cultural importance. These will be myths whose familiar patterns pop up again and again in relation to Jung's theory and to human psychological and cultural development. Some of the myths we'll discuss will be Oedipus, Sibyl and Attis, Amor and Psyche, Isis and Osiris, Perseus, and others. The idea will be, as we've done today, to link up the mythical patterns that appear in these myths with the patterns of individual development, individuation, that can be traced in human cultural and psychological development. And yeah, another kind of heads up is that this course, as I said, this isn't a course where we're just going to go through myth after myth after myth after myth and kind of pull it apart. We will pull some apart, and we'll talk about how different people pull myths apart. But as I said, there's no possible way you can cover all of world mythology. There's so many different ways to go through it. So what I'm trying to do is create an inroad for people who want to expand their repertoire of myths and understand what they're looking for and how to go about looking for it in a directed way. And I think we provide that in this course. So this is the one module where we'll go into a lot of myths. The next two, we also will go into more myths than the others, because we're going to look at two Jungian oriented theorists, one of which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So as I said, we're going to there's a lot of reasons to read different theorists. These two, Joseph Campbell and Mircea Eliade, are particularly rich because they are sympathetic to Jung, and they open up very, very fruitful avenues of thought and discussion around particular myths, very much in line with what Jung might have said. So in this fifth module, we'll look at the work of Joseph Campbell. Campbell was very much influenced by Jung's work, and like Jung, he's not highly regarded in the contemporary field of folklore and mythology. Even so, his thought is very much in line with Jung, and he can quickly introduce the reader to a broad range of different myths and mythic patterns, and he often will make those leaps of amplification. He'll talk about the parallels in other myths that come to a similar point in a similar direction and might have parallels in dream and other things. Now, another one many of you may not be aware of, and this is someone I really love. He's a wonderful writer. He presented, well, let me see what I got here. Yeah, he was a friend with Jung. He met Jung at the Eranos conferences where both men presented papers. He corresponded with Jung, and so he's very much, as a matter of fact, after seeing Jung present on alchemy at the Eranos conferences, he did a nice book on alchemy from called the Forge and the Crucible, on alchemy and the history from the perspective of the history of religions. So he subsequently took a position as a professor of religious studies at the University of Chicago. He was one of the main sort of key figures in religious studies for about 50 years or so. But in recent times, due to his sympathetic view towards Jung and his focus on patterns in religion, which was a very big thing, he focused on partly because it revealed these same kind of patterns that Jung talks about. But today in religious studies circles, they talk more about individual nuances and details, and they're not as interested in patterns. So because of all this, Eliade has greatly fallen out of favor in religious studies circles. However, for those same reasons, he's very, very rich for us. He's, especially his book, one we're going to talk about a lot, is called The Sacred and the Profane. And it really talks about religion in a broad sense in a way that I think really resonates, certainly resonates for most Jungians. And I think he's a very exciting, the other thing is exciting about him, he's got a ton of great books on myth, and he's got several sort of overarching theories that talk about patterns and how they repeat. But he also he synthesizes the work of a lot of other people, which is one of the reasons he's criticized. But in fact, it exposes us to a lot of different stories and a lot of different myths that we probably wouldn't dig out for ourselves. So he's a great, great resource for someone who wants to develop their repertoire of myth and understanding myth. Campbell and Eliade, a Jungian anyways, who wants to do this, or someone who's interested in depth psychology, Campbell and Mircea Eliade are just terrific.
Hey, James.
Yeah.
Question, will we have an opportunity to look at and discuss modern myths, for example, new cosmology?
We can certainly bring that up. That's not something I'm thinking of focusing on, although probably the place that would come up would be the last module. This seventh module, we want to talk about world religions as myth, and I'm particularly interested in something that very few people really grasp. Certainly they don't grasp in a way that Jungian would, and that's something they call the axial age. The axial age is when people went from what they call cosmic maintenance, or performing sacrifices so that the gods would do something, to a switch where what happened to you ultimately in life was up to you, up to your behavior and up to your choices, rather than up to you could behave really badly, but if you perform the sacrifice to the god, then you could be off the hook and still get to heaven. Whereas there was a switch in the axial age to self-agency, which is very important. So we're going to talk about that and how Jung understood the world religions as a psychotherapeutic system in Module 7. And then in Module 8, we're going to be talking about the loss of myth. And I'm interested when we're pretty much, with this description of this module, we're pretty much done with what I wanted to present. So whoever said that about the contemporary myth, I'd like to hear more about that. But let me just finish here. Oops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry, hold on. Yeah, so What most people in our culture have failed to understand is the role of myth in regulating grandiose energies. In our final module of the course, we'll reflect on the cultural implications of the loss of myth in the contemporary world. For centuries, numinous archetypal energies of the collective unconscious were contained and regulated by religious beliefs and religious practices, i.e. by what I've been calling the natural individuation process. With the loss of myth, the loss of what sociologist Peter Berger has called the sacred canopy, we've also lost our greatest container of grandiose archetypal energies and our most effective guard against cultural psychosis, and for that matter, individual psychosis. So in this final module, we will look at the loss of myth in contemporary culture, what different ideologies and myths have replaced these older myths. And this is where that question about new cosmologies and things. What I'm thinking about here primarily is how religious, rather political ideologies and various sort of cultural phenomena, the phenomena of fascination with wealth and fascination with celebrity and these kind of things. But I'm interested in knowing any kind of positive cosmology that's modern that I'm not aware of. So, and we'll also talk about, I hope, what we each might do to contribute to greater cultural well-being through whatever work we can do to address this loss of connection with the deep unconscious, previously through myth, and now certainly many of us are trying to do this through depth psychology. So next week, the 3rd, is the first class, the first module of the course. We've already got several people lined up, and hope to see more of you if you find this all intriguing. And right now the early bird special price goes until the 27th. Last day you can get that is the 27th of February. We always end up extending it, so I just extended it from the beginning. And the last registrations will be taken, I think, the day of the course, which would be, I think it's the 3rd, next week, March the 3rd. So that's my presentation. Thank you all very, very much for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have some questions so we can discuss. Anyone? I know that if you're shy, you can just write it down in the chat area. I'll go, Jeremy. I know you've always got a question.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
Consumer cosmology from Anne. What is consumer cosmology, Anne? I mean, it certainly is a consumer culture we're in.
Yeah. Hi, James.
Hi.
Well, I just am aware that there's, in the work of like Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, there's a new cosmology, and it's based on the new story of the universe. But if we're not held in that old, in the structure of myth, like in the old world religions, and if we're kind of working on our own so-called artificial individuation without any guiding myth, then it's so easy to fall prey to this kind of, it's almost like consumerism is the religion, is the myth then.
Yeah.
Right. And
well,
I guess it's a very broad
sure.
statement, so it's just really a broad statement I'm making.
Yeah, no, and that's very directly, I think, related to what I was saying earlier, which seems to be a dominant myth, which is money. Consumerism is we hold as high gods the people who make a lot of money. Yep. And they perpetuate this mythology that we have to get the new, if you don't get the newest iPhone, well, I mean, you're just in the backwaters of society. So there's just all this thing of everything is planned obsolescence. And I mean, they do this in the music world, which drives me crazy. Like the newest thing is supposed to be the best music. And for my money, I haven't heard anybody yet that beats Billie Holiday and Louis Armstrong. And so,
and I have another quick question, James.
Yes.
This is still Anne. I was just about to put it in the chat. Earlier in this session, when you were talking about the process of moving, go from reason to intuition, and that wider level of cultural development, is it possible that you could also say that we're moving from reason to imagination?
Sure. Yeah. The reason I say intuition, partly because it's part of Jung's little lexicon of the 4 functions, but imagination, certainly in the sense of active imagination, which means imagination, I can just sit around all afternoon and imagine something beautiful, and then go back to sleep. If imagination then inspires me to create a work of art or to create something for people or to do a public service of some kind, or if it causes me to, in other words, the connection has to be, the ego self axis has to be a part of it, so that the ego, the conscious, rational thinking mind, needs to engage whatever I imagine and kind of try to bring it to birth in a way that's concrete for me. Now, it can just be, certainly imagination is a great thing just to do as relaxation. I'm not saying that you shouldn't relax, but does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm also referring to an imagination that's deeply relational, and that allows us to have some kind of a partnership relationship with others and with the natural world, where we can come back into a mythology that creates a better world, you know?
Yes, and another thing I haven't really spoken much about is that, and for you may have already noticed, I'm more of an introvert. You know, it works really well for me to sit in a room by myself and talk to people, because I'm, you know, I don't, if I'm in a room full of people, it's not as easy to do as I can do it because I'm more introverted, I've learned. But naturally, when you ask that question, I thought imagination in an introverted way. You're talking about people and bringing it into a social context. That's an extroverted response. So there are introverted and extroverted responses to these things. And if I'm continuing to only do introverted things, then I'm not separating those two little balls that we saw. I'm not doing that individuation work.
Right, but you could also work on your own active imagination, or work on that with the therapist in a kind of an introverted way where it was very productive, I think.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great.
But again, if it doesn't, again, because it's something that I need to teach myself. I keep repeating, if I don't do something that brings it into the world.
Right, yeah, great. Thank you, James.
Sure, thanks. Now I saw another.
Yeah, we had a couple come in. Susan, I think you kind of answered that question when you were talking about money, maybe. Is there a particular myth that you think speaks especially strong to our time?
To me, that is one of the major ones, money and power, and which relates to political things. And I'm not saying those are good myths. Those are just ones where people naturally gravitate, tend to put their numinous projections onto these things.
Yep, and I think one asked about
the book. The book is The Jung and Jungians on Myth by Stephen Walker. I think it's Stephen Walker. Let me check that.
Is it a good introduction to Jung, is what Laura was
asking. Introduction to Jung. Well, that depends on, well, that book is a pretty good introduction to Jung. He has a very nice, as I said, it's a drawback for people who know a lot about Jung. But if you don't know much about Jung, this book on myth, yes, it's Jung and the Jungians on Myth by Stephen Walker. And that does have good introductory material in it. The one we used for the textbook for the Jung 101 class was Jung's Map of the Soul by Murray Stein, and that's an excellent book. It goes into great detail of the fine points of Jung's theory, and it actually cites and can direct you to Jung's own writings, and it has some samples of his writings, but all of it is grounded in Jung's own writings. Jung's got some wonderful books of his own, Man's Search for a Soul, Search for Certainty, Psychology and Religion. There's a lot of good introductory Jung books out there by him. Most people are better off starting with something like on those short introductions, Anthony Stevens, who's one of my favorite Jungians, wrote a book called, I think it's Jung, A Short Introduction, something like that Oxford series of very short introductions. There's one on Jung in that by Anthony Stevens. And if you write to me, I can think of some others. So Charmel asks about the connection to gun culture. And that is there's something that a lot of people don't understand about the warrior archetype, and that it's connected to the hunter archetype. And the gun culture is very much connected to the warrior archetype. And when people go off the rails with a gun, I would say it's a warrior archetype that's gone out of control. However, it's kind of psychosis around the warrior archetype. what has to happen in our culture that is not being recognized is a respect for. See, it's part of this going back to the 2 million-year-old man. The way we all started was that we were hunters. And modern culture is stamping out that connection to they were hunter-gatherers, and men were always hunters. And when we stamp out gun culture just mindlessly, we stamp out the real. I think a lot of these men are trying to connect to that hunter, that 2 million-year-old man in them who was a hunter. And absolutely, I'm not in favor of people having massive guns and these heavy artillery, military weapons is insane. But rather than splitting into two sides, I think it's really important to at least recognize the role of the hunter, the archetype of the hunter, how it's connected to the warrior, and how it's vital for all of us to kind of get in touch with that old hunter-gatherer within each of us. That's kind of my short answer to it. There's got a lot more to say about it, but that's
and that may be a lack of initiation, which is
it's absolutely a lack of initiation.
Which is lack of myth. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. Is half of our culture, not more than half, most of our culture has not been initiated into adulthood, and we're all just adolescents. I mean, you see the entire Congress is nothing but adolescents. I mean, there's a handful of mature people in there. But yeah. So what would be the best way to raise our hand if we have a question? Well, there is a hand raising thing. You can just unmute yourself down the lower left corner. There's a little microphone with a line through it. If you click that and just speak up, you can, it's all right, Rebecca. You can speak up whenever you want to.
Okay, then I'm going to do it now.
Okay. Good.
I couldn't find the raise my hand button, and I was trying to be polite.
Well, I got to you on the list anyway, so you were coming next anyway.
Yeah,
so.
It was perfect. So I'm really interested. So I've read quite a bit of Neumann. I was in the philosophy, cosmology, consciousness program at CIS. And I think what's been missing for me is in a lot of the conversations around myth, we are focused on the hero's journey, and I feel like the Neumann transformation myth doesn't really get talked about.
I agree with that a lot, yeah.
So I'd love to know your take of how Jung would orient to the transformation myth.
Well, Jung, wrote the introduction to, or wrote a foreword or something to Origins and History of Consciousness. So he was very much, he loved Neumann, and they argued about everything, but they were very, very good friends and loved each other. So I think he'd definitely be in favor of what Neumann has to say about transformation. And I think matter of fact, Neumann was trying to push the idea that never seemed to catch on, but I like it very much, which was instead of individuation, he talked about centroversion. So instead of being introverted or extroverted, you become centroverted. So everything kind of is again, moving. That's his way of articulating individuation. But yeah, and that second part of Origins and History of Consciousness just has some brilliant things about the role of the great individual and carrying myth and all that. So I'm not sure I'm not sure what I would say about. But an interesting thing about Neumann was that he was not quite up to speed with where Jung was on alchemy. A lot of people took a while to catch up to where Jung was, partly because he hadn't published that much. And so I think Neumann would have been very much. I think Jung would have pushed Neumann more towards the alchemical conjunctio idea of transformation through the conjunctio, and I think that. Neumann would have. I would have loved to see Neumann run with the alchemy. He mentions the Ouroboros and a couple of things in Origin and History, but I would like to have seen him do more. Jung said himself that Neumann was able to take his work much farther than he was able to take it in that direction, just simply because he wasn't pioneering. He was just articulating further what Jung had already done. So I think he could have done the same thing with alchemy, which would have been very nice.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. That's kind of a helpful lens to orient to that through Jung.
I'm glad.
Thanks
for asking. So it's like loss of myth and no myth is why American appears to be. Yeah, well, and what Jeremy said too. Chris says this loss of myth is why America appears to be in a mass psychosis. And now again, we're talking about alchemy, which is one of the myths, certainly the final myth that Jung really studied at length. And in order for the operation, usually before the conjunctio, it's a separatio, where everything is separated into two completely separate categories, absolute pure separateness. And we seem to be at that phase now. Whether the conjunctio will, be a nuclear conjunctio or a concrete conjunctio or a consciousness raising conjunctio. I can't say, but I do agree that not only loss of myth, but what Jeremy said about initiation, that the lack of initiation is just shameful in this all over the world. And the only initiations we have are initiations into how to steal or into how to get away with something. And there's very little. The old, like the founding fathers of the country and everything, they were in an era when all of education was around development of character, and now it's about the development of acquisitiveness, either acquiring power or acquiring money. But the idea of character is like, well, if having a good character will help me to make more money, then great. But so yeah, Chris, I agree with very much with what you're saying, with the caveat that I'd like to add the lack of initiation in there. So Gary says there is also the shift from a linear vertically integrated way of being and seeing in the world to a more networked, rational basis of living in community, which includes a shift from ownership to sharing, especially in the realms of personal ownership. Yeah, and this is thanks to women. I mean, the more we can put women in power and empower women, this whole change of this hierarchical thing to, in some fields they call it agonic and hedonic, and the, I'm trying to remember which is which, but yeah, the idea of sharing and being a community and make sure everybody's taken care of, that very much is embraced by women when they get into power and are able to have some kind of efficacy outside of this patriarchal framework that they have to work in. But I agree with that 100%, Gary. That is definitely a shift that's happening, and I just wish it would happen faster. Yeah. So Anne also says, yes, and the neurosis leads to physical symptoms like autoimmune disease, separation sicknesses, and yes, she agrees with Gary. So how do you distinguish, Judith says, how do you distinguish myths and fairy tales? A recurrent theme of the Snow White Red Rose story keeps popping up in dream stories I write in personal relationships in 2 parts of myself. So yeah, it's kind of it's certainly a legitimate distinction. Marie-Louise von Franz talks about it at length. Jung didn't talk about it quite so much, I think, because he was he thought that fairy tales were closer to the actual structures of the unconscious, because myths tend to, yeah, just as world religions do, myths tend to they get worked over more and more and more, so they're more made by committee, whereas fairy tales tend to be shaped by 1 or 2 psyches, because of the storyteller will embellish it and change it, but then it goes to another story and they embellish it and change it. Whereas myths have to be accepted by a committee. They have to be accepted by whole societies. And when different elements become dominant in a society, they tend to alter the myths to reflect that. Whereas the fairy tales were told around the fire in people's homes and in the taverns and places like that. So they were reflective, Jung thought, of more the real structures of the psyche, the basic structures. And he left a lot of that. He knew that von Franz was fascinated with them, was working with them. So he left a lot of that work to her, I think. So she is the place to go for that. And she articulates that difference much better than I just did, but that's the main difference. Okay.
How does Eros and Psyche appear in culture now?
Say it again.
How does Eros and Psyche appear in culture today?
You mean like by Eros, you mean Amor and Psyche, the myth, or you mean just generally Eros? There's a myth, Amor and Psyche, and Amor is sometimes called Eros. And it's actually a story that was told by Apuleius in the book The Golden Ass.
The myth.
Yeah, well, certainly Neumann wrote a fabulous book, highly recommend it. I mean, usually you're better served reading a woman's take on feminine psychology, but Neumann's explanation of or dissection of the tale of Amor and Psyche, which appears in Apuleius's The Golden Ass, is excellent, and he attributes it to a woman's. He says it's a story of feminine development. I was saying that there are other stories that are more. Matter of fact, all of Apuleius's golden ass has a lot to do with male and female relating to the feminine. But how that appears in psyche is, I think that this is the tasks that Aphrodite sets forth to Amor in the tale are the tasks that women need to master to develop their psyches along these lines. So that's where it appears in psyches in culture, is that it's a tale of feminine development in relation to the feminine, and women, in order to develop in culture, in order to succeed, have to at least accept and try to change the current patriarchal system, which is very different from the feminine developmental patterns that show up in that myth. So, I mean, there's this constant tension between, and this, I think this is another reason why there's this mass psychosis is, I forget who said that, but is that this, I mean, the shift to the feminine, the shift to this Amor psyche type of myth, this partnership type of myth away from the patriarchal one, is perceived by men, particularly men in poorer, lesser educated areas. This is happening. The shift is happening, and they feel it as a great loss, as a great oppression of them, and as this whole business of making America great again and all that kind of stuff. It's all about trying to not lose the elite status that they've had for centuries. And so that's the men, certainly a certain type of men are just terrified of losing this, whatever elite status they imagined they have. And so they fight against any sort of feminine energy coming in. And for a woman to develop, naturally, she has to develop those feminine energies. So she's going to be at odds with people who are still clinging to this system, which is slowly, I mean, just showing its bad side. That's my response to that. I hope that helps.
So James, isn't it? So with a lack of myth, though, we can have the understanding, we can learn, we can do classes like this, we can read.
Hey, can you speak up? I missed that.
Yeah, with the lack of myth that we have, it's like Nietzsche said, "God's dead and we killed him," and what do we do now?
Right.
And it feels like maybe Jung his work was to answer that question to me.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's the ultimate answer, but certainly,
Right.
I mean, if you read Edinger, he says absolutely Jung was the savior and he did all the.
Yeah,
I don't go quite that far, but the answer definitely is to listen. The answer is definitely for this huge patriarchal monstrosity that's been constructed, to allow in the feminine energy, to be more aware of it, to kind of, the conjunctio can never happen if we don't adapt to that. And we need to do it without it's not like a swing of the pen. We don't want it to be a swing of the pendulum where then suddenly everything becomes feminine and
right.
masculinity is suppressed or oppressed. There needs to be a partnership, and there needs to be a sense of it's for everybody's best interest for us to access every positive energy, every scrap of positive energy we can get. So yeah, I mean, I think that attitude of listening to the unconscious and allowing that to come up without losing whatever positive values there are in the masculine rational consciousness has gotten us through a couple thousand years with a lot of bloodshed, but some good developments as well. And we need to be able to hold on to the positive things, the ideas of education and being able to keep people safe, and the whole hunting for the support of the tribe thing, protecting the tribe, all that kind of thing. We want to keep those kind of things without just going crazy and killing everybody.
All right, I think we had a bunch pop up here. Will we have access to the class via recordings after each class? Yeah,
That's again, we're at the mercy of technology, but so far, I don't want to touch wood. So far, we have not lost any classes. Sometimes we have forgotten, but gotten on eventually. But if everything goes well, yes, every and a lot of people have become very dependent on that. The classes will not be posted on, this class will be posted on Depth Psychology Alliance, but the future ones will only be posted in it's called Haiku. I think they may have changed the name to Power Learning, but they'll be posted on that site. You'll have access to it as soon as we can get it up. The Haiku will not actually be available. I'm changing the way I've been doing it. It won't be available now until it may be the introduction may be available, but the whole platform won't be available until the Monday following. In other words, next week on Saturday, there'll be a class, and so Haiku will be fully open for Module 1 on that following Monday. That way, last time a lot of people signed up late, and it just got confusing with where the platform was going. So we're going to do that. So they will be available there. This class should be available, if not tomorrow, then certainly by Monday. I'm going to, post it everywhere I can, but they will be available along with whatever other resources are posted on the class. And even if you don't have to go for the certificate in order to have access to these things. You need to do the assignments if you want the certificate. Otherwise, everything's just available. You can go through it as you want. The one we started in October is still open, so people are still working, going back and looking at the classes or using the resources. So I try to leave it open for as long as I can.
And it's definitely still a joy to sit through the lectures, and you definitely benefit if you do not participate in the certification process.
Yeah, and a lot of people have been doing that. And I know there's some people who had taken earlier courses and couldn't do it, but they paid for it anyways, and they're still, they're working through the class now. So.
We got one from Anne. Part of the feminine is not knowing a liminal space between the stories. This can feel threatening.
Say that again. Is that on the? I don't see that.
Yeah, part of the feminine is not knowing.
Yeah.
A liminal space between the stories. This can feel threatening.
Yeah, that's very nicely said, Ann. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, and that's part of what we need to be willing to wait and see what the next myth is going to be, and see what. And part of the new myth may be more of an individual. Coming to individual realization, which is part of the depth psychology, the Jungian model, rather than one myth fits all.
And Chris also said, merging science and religion is where there is a spark.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think and I don't know about I don't know. For me, what Jung has to say about that is absolutely. I mean, I think people say, even Murray Stein says, well, I don't know if Jung's scientific, but he does this. But I think he's absolutely scientific. I mean, he's very, the difference is the data that he's studying scientifically is only available to the individual who experiences it and the one that they share that with. And Jung, some people say, well, it's subjective. If someone tells you a dream, you don't know if they're lying or not. But for Jung, that made absolutely no difference whatsoever, because as he said to one woman, she said, Dr. Jung, I fooled you. Everything I did was made up. He said, well, you made it up. Where did it come from? It came from your imagination. It came from your unconscious. So the fact that you chose those particular things to make up, I stand by my, my interpretation of them. So, I think that even people who kind of criticize that don't really get what Jung's doing or how he's doing it or why he's doing it.
Is there any Celtic myths in your?
Say it again?
Is there going to be any Celtic myths?
We can do. I can tell you that for me, I'm primarily Scottish, some Irish. I think I'm like 1/8 Irish. My father's mother was 100% Irish. Everybody else is either Scots-Irish or straight Scots. So Celtic myths are very powerful for me. So I'd be happy to do that. I don't plan to do any particular. My goal in this is to make possible, give people access to the resources that are going to serve them best. If we did only Celtic myths, they might not be. What I want to make clear to people is that, for example, if you have a Celtic background, Celtic myths are likely going to resonate for you more than, say, Russian myths. Not necessarily. I mean, it depends on what your particular complexes are, what your particular needs are. But it's always a rich experience for someone to be able to see the common patterns that have arisen in the psyches of their own tribe. So yeah, I definitely would love to talk about Celtic myths. I don't have a plan particularly. I'll think about that and see what I come up with. I like when I read Celtic myths. I like my access to Celtic myths has been through Yeats, the poetry of Yeats. I love Yeats, so I wouldn't mind bringing Yeats into it, even though it's not exactly myth. Although he wrote some great, Yeats went around and collected Celtic stories and the Celtic Twilight and all these different collections that he had of just local Irish people telling the stories that they do. So I like this one here, Gary Bartlett. I finished the MA and PhD process at Pacifica and I'm about finished with the dissertation process. Having done that, I still see a great value in courses such as this because each time you go back to the myths and Jung, Campbell, Eliade, Hillman, etc., new energy comes forward with new insights arise. Yes, thank you. All those who haven't signed up yet, please read Gary's message. Unsolicited testimonial.
Definitely.
Thank you all. I'm happy to go on. Are there more questions? You've stuck it out for quite a while. I appreciate it, guys.
Yeah, this was a great class.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody. This will be available on the DPA and wherever else I can manage to get it posted. And please let me know if you have thoughts or questions.